And it's now my pleasure to introduce the award-winning curator and producer and the queen of the festival herself, Claudia Norman.
Hola, buenas noches. Hola, how are you? 2025 marks the 21st edition of this festival. So we've been doing this since 2004, and this year, as probably you are aware, has been one of the most challenging years to produce a festival dedicated to contemporary culture, Mexican culture and specifically. So we are in a city that fortunately have the artists, the audiences, but also the supporters that had been aware of what it means to produce independently a festival. So this is pretty much a product, this is a project based on love, conviction, and determination to really, really change this narrative of providing a Mexican culture, a linear way of a Mexican culture, and not basically the diversity and craziness, because it's crazy. Mexican culture is crazy. We have the panel this morning with Jasmina, and we were talking about Elena Garro, and we talk about how difficult it is to describe somebody that represents so many faces, and this is who we are. So we are a festival supported specifically this year by two organizations who had been supporting us for the last couple of years, and I want to thank the Mexican Cultural Studies. I want to thank the NYU, the Department of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and I'm a creative producer. When they ask me what is my profession, I say I'm a creative producer. People say, what is that? So I try to answer, and I said, just follow what I do. I do everything, a little bit of everything, so that makes you a creative producer. So this year, we created the Creative Independent Producers Association. We've been able to get funding, and this year are sponsoring Mexico Now. I'm very happy to have one of our fellows doing, have you seen the visuals? So it's thanks to having a fellow supported by SIPA. So, and we just keep going that way. So, as I said, a very challenging year to produce a festival. And we suddenly thought that we won't be able to do it, but we have the people, which basically we do this for the people as well. And we create a committee, and I want to thank Cristina Castañeda, Mónica Antere Ramírez, Mayra Megal, Marcia de la Garza, Roberto Alcázar, and Lorea Canales for coming up with funding to make this possible. We are bringing this year, we apply for visas, we are covering airfares, and we have the support of the committee, but also the ambassadors, Hector Maxis, Javier Salomón, Kimberly Firgi, and Manuel Tascon, with the support of Alo Gorospe, that is part of the team also, to put together this idea of having a new branch of supporters called Amigos del Festival, so friends of the festival, and Jose is one of them. Thank you, Marcia, and we are inviting you to become amigo if you are part of the committee or part of the ambassadors. So for me, it's when we thought about doing this incredible year and journey, it was an honor to have Rafael Barajas, El Fisgón, so accepting our invitation to come this year to talk about. So, do you know El Fisgón? Have you been following El Fisgón? Raise your hand. Yes, yes, okay. So, basically, Rafael Barajas, best known as El Fisgón, is one of the most important cartoonists working for lately the La Jornada newspaper. He is a scholar. He is a Guggenheim recipient. He, as you can see, has published many books about art and history and politics. You can see him on TV. He's also a producer, an independent producer. He's a cartoonist. He's incredible. And I'm so honored to have Rafael Barajas El Fisgón to take us back into the role of humor. I think we just saw how priceless is to have, to laugh, to smile when we are in difficult times and crisis. So I will leave Rafael to take us back in time and into this amazing research that he just did for a couple of years. So thank you to the staff, Carla, and all the volunteers, Adriana, Alejandra, Carla Prieto, and everyone who has the individual donors who have donated. So at the back, at the end, you can get your books. You can get, if you want, you can donate. We encourage you to do that. By buying a book, you are donating, you are supporting, is another way to support. So thank you, and officially we start Mexico Now 2025. Thank you for being here.
Being here with you. Well, I have to say a couple of things before starting. I am the conference deals about a subject that I've been working on for, I'm ashamed to say it, but for decades, and it's I believe it's what I'm going to talk about are the conclusions of a 20 or 25 years long investigation. It's funny because when I was just finishing the book, I realized I have been making an investigation about Mexican caricature of the 19th century, and when I finished the book, I realized there was a lot of there was much more than what I could say for only Mexican caricature in the 19th century. There are some links with some very complex issues that come from the 17th, 18th century, and I made an exhibition with that material, and what I'm going to show you is precisely the conclusions of that exhibition. It's basically the conclusion of 20 and more years of work. I usually don't read in my conferences. I usually sing what I have to say. But nowadays, since I'm speaking in English, not in Spanish, I will have to. I'm sorry, but I had to read it. I have to write it. I had to write it in English, so it can be fluid and nothing passes me by. So I'm going to talk to you about a subject that's been, I believe that's the subject of my life. It's caricature and revolution, and the main problem is, the main theme is, can art transform society? That's the main point of the talk right now. And I believe that art can be very powerful. Works of art provoke strong aesthetic emotions and make us think. Art can transform our lives in many, many ways, especially when it deals with profound themes. Indignation in the face of cruelty and injustice and the search for a better world can, and also should, be important themes for an artist. In fact, some of the greatest works of art of all centuries, from Francisco de Goya's The Disasters of War to Pablo Picasso's Guernica, or the best graffitis of Michel Basquiat or Bansky, are born from the feelings awakened by the world's injustices. Indignation in the face of injustice is almost always linked to a political stance, to taking sides, but above all, it is linked to an ethical posture, and consequently, it has repercussions in aesthetics. The basic question, the fundamental question is, can art transform society? Can art trigger radical processes and change the world? And the answer is yes, it can. And in the next few minutes, you will see how, in fact, art changed Western culture and contributed to the democratization and politicization of Europe and the United States. The corollary of this research is that an avant-garde artistic current is at the origin of the first social revolution in history. And I'm talking, of course, about the Mexican Revolution. This is a story that goes against the grain of the grand narrative of Western art history, and especially it's against the history of avant-gardes in modern art. It's a rereading of what avant-gardes in modern art are. I have to say that stories are very powerful. Narratives order our beliefs, and therefore they govern our lives more than we would like to accept. One of the most potent narratives in the West is that of the history of modern art, and that especially the one of the artistic avant-gardes of the 20th century. That's the grain of the history of modern art. For years, the dominant view of art has been that, since the 18th century, genius artists have confronted prevailing prejudices to liberate their creative and potential and achieve a total self-expression. So the liberation of colors and forms, whose highest manifestation is the avant-gardes, and especially American abstract expressionism, and the creative explosion of concepts, which is conceptual art, and those, according to that narrative, those are the ultimate expressions of creative artistic genius. I think they're not, and I'm going to tell you why. This narrative, which I just synthesized, is very powerful. It positions Western art as a liberating, creating force. It is the basis of an art market that moves billions of dollars every year and makes all artistic manifestations that fall outside this narrative marginal. In that history, for example, Latin American art or African art have not contributed much to humanity and art. They are subsidiary and only have a value when they relate to that narrative. So, for example, only artists that have been in America or Europe are considered in that narrative. That's the case of Wilfredo Lam, that's the case of Rufino Tamayo, and more recently of Gabriel Orozco, no? But the history of art that I will present you here does not focus on brilliant artistic discoveries. It does not focus on great masterpieces that move us. It focuses on processes that took time and it speaks of how art gradually transformed Western society in very concrete ways between the 18th and the 20th centuries. It is a history in which we can see how popular discoveries, small format works, prints, technological innovations, utopian political ideas, and major and minor artists can slowly change their society and made it more sensitive, more free, more democratic, and more active. Our history pays special attention to how the idea emerged that the artist can be the vanguard of social change. Everyone thinks, when we speak about artistic vanguards, everyone thinks about the 1920s, but that's a lie. Artistic avant-gardes began one century earlier, in the 1820s, and they had to go through a very complex process to arrive to the 20th century. This, in my investigation, I study the importance of the discovery of lithography. This investigation also reviews the birth in France of the first political cartoon magazine, which is La Caricature, which was founded in 1830. And it narrates how cartoon magazines proliferated in various countries. Western art history is completely Eurocentric and rarely contemplates artistic phenomena from other latitudes. In our talk, we will see how the example of La Caricature, directed by Charles Philippon, arrived in Mexico in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and soon developed its own characteristics. Mexican cartoon magazines were a vital part of the liberal combat press, and with El Hijo del Aguizote and El Colmillo Público, which are two magazines that lasted the first one lasted 17 years, the second one lasted only 3 years. But those two magazines ended up being a school of popular political training and an apparatus of agitation and propaganda that gave rise to the Mexican Revolution. This essay, what I'm talking to you about, what I will talk to you about, centers on the importance of art in politics. It is a decolonial revision of Western art history, and especially it's a decolonial revision of the history of the artistic avant-gardes. I would like to start very far away. I'm going to start in the Middle Ages or something like that. And don't worry, it's a fascinating story. You won't be bored, I hope, and we will arrive to the 20th century quite fast. Nowadays, in the second decade of the 21st century, in the year of the great entertainment history, in the era of television, of the internet, of streaming platforms, of mobile phones, strident advertising, and artificial intelligence, it is difficult to visualize that for most of human history, images created by man were very scarce. They were a very scarce commodity. In the age of selfies, it is hard to believe that still at the beginning of the 19th century, only very, very rich people could afford a portrait. You could have a mirror, but a portrait painted by some, it really costed a lot. It costed a bundle. And likewise, in the age of TikTok, it's hard to understand that for centuries, only the state and its ideological apparatuses had the capacity to commission images that transmitted a worldview. The democratization and citizenization of art and the transition from religious images to combat cartoons were long and slow processes that took place in Europe over several centuries and have very clear stages. I'm going to start with this image. I don't know what's... Oops, yeah, that's it. For centuries in the West, artists limited themselves to working for the state in power or for their patrons and benefactors. Only kings, nobles, rulers, great merchants, or ecclesiastic hierarchs could commission images. The arrival of a market for popular prints, which were mostly initially religious, was the first process of democratization of art. You can see that with this image of Lucas Cranach. This is the crucifixion of Lucas Cranach, which is in a church in Germany. And the only means you could have to, a normal people could have to bring that image home was through a print. So this is a very peculiar case, but because Lucas Cranach first made the engraving and then he painted the big image, you know. But if you wanted to have the protection of a saint, the only way you could do it physically to bring the image home is through an engraving. That's the only way you could bring that home, because to paint a real oil picture of the saint was very, very expensive. In the 16th century, in Italy, to amuse himself and to mock the rigid aesthetic canons of the academy, the manierist artist from Bologna, Annibale Carracci, made a series of amusing drawings that exaggerated the imperfections of the features of the characters he portrayed. Carracci, as you can see here on the right, there's a page of doodles made by Carracci. And you can see he made some portraits of people that he found on the street, and he just draw them. And Carracci himself baptized his discovery with the name of ritratti caricati, which means loaded portraits. That is where the drawing technique known as caricature was born. The term caricature comes from the Italian caricare, which means to load, to exaggerate a person's features. The caricaturist's strategy consists on accentuating the defects of their subject, highlighting their most characteristic features, those that make the subject unique. Disrespectful art soon created a very specific print market in which artists like Guercino or Jacques Callot participated. Here on my left, on your right, you have a drawing by Jacques Callot. It's an engraving that portraits, I think I'm blocking you, maybe if I sit a little bit farther, it would be better. But it's, as you can see, Jacques Callot used to make engravings of people of La Comedia dell'arte, of dwarfs and things like that, people with exaggerated traits. And that's where the market of exaggerated art began. And that's not a minor thing for our conference. In the 17th century, the book and the engraving became effective propaganda tools, and prints played an active role in the political and religious debate of that time. In the 18th century, the Netherlands, which was a Spanish colony, became one of the largest centers of the printing industry. And there, amid the political and religious debate between Catholics and Protestants, various artists started publishing sophisticated allegories of religious and political content. Not only religious content, but also political content. One example is this printing by Philibert Boutats, which you can see this image. It's fantastic because in many ways it evokes, it's inspired in an image of La Pietà, you know, when the Christ descends from the cross and Mother Mary comes to Christ. But this is, as a matter of fact, a very interesting piece because it deals with a financial scandal, a financial bubble, no? And it is what I'm trying to draw the attention here in this image is the fact that these are the allegories were no longer only religious. They started being allegories with political concern, that dealt with financial themes, with the lascivity of a prince, the stupidity of a duke, and things like that. So that changed a lot of things, because in Western Europe, during the Enlightenment, which is from the mid-18th century to the early 19th centuries, ordinary citizens began to participate in the political debate, and eventually the press established itself as the main vehicle for public discussion. Over several generations, writers and artists waged a strong battle for public opinion in newspapers, pamphlets, pasquinades, and flyers. And in this battle, printed materials with images had a peculiarity. They could transmit something more than ideas. They could transmit visions, and this changes everything. This is when political allegories were born. We have to say that gradually, and very specially in Great Britain, a market for popular prints dealing with various themes was consolidated. In particular, prints with humorous intent were very well received. The first great British satirical engraver and painter was William Hogarth, who was considered to be, with Jonathan Swift, one of the sharpest critics of the hypocrisy of the upper classes in England. In the 1730s, Hogarth published several prints criticizing the vices of the elites of his time. He made group portraits, which are called conversational pieces, in informal settings, which denounced the lack of ethics of certain actors and social groups. This is a print which I love. It's the 4 Stages of Cruelty, who depicts the story of a man called Tom Nero. And it depicts how Tom Nero began being cruel with animals, with small animals, with dogs and rats and chicken, and then he became cruel with larger animals. Here you can see him kicking a horse, hitting a horse. Then there's cruelty in perfection when Tom Nero kills his wife, his mistress. And the reward of cruelty is something that used to happen at the time, that when criminals were executed, their body was given then later to the hospitals or to medical schools. So people would practice with them, with their bodies. The medical students would practice with their bodies. As you can see, this is a brutal image of Tom Nero being butchered by the doctors of the hospital. And that's, of course, a moral issue, no? Most scholars of the disrespectful art agree with what wrote Ernest H. Gombrich, who argues that political caricature was consolidated in England between the mid-18th century and the early 19th centuries. That's when English satirical draftsmen synthesized 2 traditions of political graphics: that of Dutch allegorical engravings, like, this is one of the traditions that they synthesized, the one of allegorical engravings, and the other one is precisely the one of caricature. You can see, oops, that one. So when they synthesized it, cartoons were born. And cartoons were very, cartoons were very effective. The first artists to professionally dedicate themselves to social and political caricatures were British. Among the first great English caricaturists, we have James Gilray, Thomas Rawlinson, and George Cruikshank. All of them published a quantity of prints in which they criticized the social customs of their time and gave moral lessons. Social criticism expanded naturally in the arena of politics. Among the images most liked by the public were those that satirized politicians and other figures of authority and power. You see, this image of James Gilray is fantastic. It's a portrait of this prime minister, this British prime minister, who started printing paper. And here you see his portrait as Midas, who's transmuting everything, who has the capacity to transmute gold into paper. It's the anti-Midas portrait. No, it's fantastic. And by breaking the rules of etiquette, good behavior, and the aesthetic canons of the academy, caricature liberated messages, thoughts, and forms. This helped to open public debate and consolidate a new market for art, the market of popular prints and especially satirical images. After this phenomenon, art ceased to be the exclusive monopoly of power groups and began to be a space for freedom and therefore for criticism and dissent. As you can see from the first image I showed you to this one, more than 2 centuries have elapsed. It's a long process, but it's a very effective one. Caricature was fundamental in the complex process of popularization and democratization of art and images that began in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was also key in a great battle of ideas that began to be waged between the oligarchies and the rest of the society at the beginning of the 19th century. This change was not only happening in England, but throughout Europe. In some countries, like Spain, it generated isolated but very powerful phenomena. In others, it was a part of an entire revolution. This was the case of France. Cartoons had a very important role in the French Revolution. The consolidation of caricature as a genre ran parallel to the eruption of the voice of citizens, of commoners, into the political arena and the establishment of the press as an ideological apparatus of the growing bourgeoisie and the popular masses. The ideological vehicle of this project of an enlightened society centered on the logic of reasons was, of course, the press. Both the American War of Independence and the French Revolution were preceded by a boom in the publication of pamphlets, leaflets, newspapers, and caricatures. Many of the founding fathers of the United States were journalists, among them Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. And some of the pamphlets they published, like Paine's Common Sense, I'm getting there. Like Paine's Common Sense, triggered the independence movement from the British Crown. In revolutionary France, caricature was the most effective, irreverent, and delirious front of the battle for the reason. It was the vanguard of the struggle to build a society centered on an enlightened public opinion. Without a doubt, the images in which the people were portrayed as the overexploited victim of the nobility and the clergy incited revolutionary action. It is clear that the images of lascivious and hypocritical priests and sadistic and foolish nobles who mistreated the defenseless people helped question the dominant faith and desacralize the nobility and the king. In the period that goes from 1789 to 1815 in France, a good part of the political debate took place through caricature. For centuries, politics was an activity reserved exclusively for the nobility and the elites. This radically changed at the end of the 18th century with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. With the cracking of the old feudal regime, the citizenization of politics accelerated in the first decades of the 19th century, and the proliferation of print with political intent was absolutely key to this process. One of the most rare examples of one of the things that happened here is that not only citizens took conscious on what was happening in the political arena, but also artists started to get involved in political themes. And of course, you find artists like Hogarth or like Gilray that got involved naturally because they had they could act freely in their society. But you also find some rare phenomena. For example, one of the most notable phenomena of the citizenization of politics was the arrival of a new type of artist, the creator who is not subject to the logics of patronage, nor the dogmas of faith, nor the canons of the academy, nor to the dominant discourse, but that rather produces his own work. That's the independent artist. The notion that we have that every artist is independent is really very new. It starts in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. That's when the first independent artists are born. By not being in the service of a power, by escaping political, ideological, or religious authority, and by having the ability to communicate ideas effectively, this type of artist played a unique role in the construction of public opinion. The most notorious example of the draftsman who establishes himself as an independent critic of the society was that of Francisco de Goya y Lucientes. Oh, sorry. I'm moving on the other. Okay. Francisco de Goya, these prints by Goya, they seem like surreal, they seem like, but no. If you watch them closely, Goya was who played an active role with the enlightened groups of Spain at the time. And all of his prints, the proverbs, the disasters of war, the caprichos, are a very specific critics, they are very critical of the society of Spain at the time. He was very cryptical because censorship was exerted no more nor less by the Holy Inquisition. So he had to make lots of turns, and he could not say things bluntly because it could have costly dear. It could have cost him a lot. And there's something else that changed everything in the graphic arts in the 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, and that's the invention or the discovery of lithography. Technical innovations played a major role in the evolution of the graphic arts that took place at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th centuries. In 1796, by accident, a German printer, whose name is Alois Senefelder, discovered a technique for printing texts and images using smooth stones. This printing technique was baptized as lithography, from the Greek lithos, which means stone, and graphein, which means to write, writing in stone. This was written or drawn in stone. Lithography turned out to be a printing technique that was much faster, more efficient, cheaper, and more durable than all those used up to that point. It allowed it allowed for lower printing costs and higher printing runs. That helped to massify the market for popular images, and that certainly opened the possibility of establishing an illustrated press industry. And this, of course, changed the art market and changed the press. Now, I'm going to speak, this is a print by, that's the technique of lithography, and this is a lithography print by Boyer, which is fantastic because you can see now that artists could freely make for a specific market, not the portrait of a duke or a king or whatever, but he could make the portrait of common peasants. That was new for the time. That was quite new, and it was a market where this woman that sells wine, and shouldn't because he sells wine to minors, as you can see, she could even buy the print herself. That was new. And that was something very different. Now, the emergence of the artist as an independent actor, the revolution of the graphic arts, the growth of the press, and the citizenization of politics forced thinkers of the early 19th century to reflect on the potential of art to transform society. Between 1789 and 1848, France was the epicenter of the cycle of liberal revolution. After the tumultuous period of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, monarchy returned to power in France in 1840. However, the citizenry did not resign itself to losing the freedoms acquired in the revolutionary period, and the new generation of radical thinkers soon emerged who promoted putting an end to the old regime once and for all. Some of these thinkers proposed that this change could be led by artists, and this is something new. In 1825, Henri de Saint-Simon, one of the first socialist philosophers, wrote, and I'm going to quote him, "It is we, the artists, who will serve as the avant-garde. The power of the art is indeed most immediate and most rapid. When we wish to spread new ideas among men, we inscribe them on marble or on canvas. And in this manner, above all, we exert an electric and victorious influence. We address ourselves to the imagination and to the sentiments of mankind. We therefore are always bound to excite the most active and decisive response." What's this? This is the birth of the thesis of the artistic avant-garde. What Saint-Simon is saying is that artists can transform society. It's incredible because everyone thinks of Saint-Simon as an utopian socialist. But these utopian socialists were not as idealistic as the term suggests. In fact, some of these thinkers proposed pragmatic projects to transform their society. If read in the historical context of the restored monarchy in France, it becomes evident that Saint-Simon's idea of artistic avant-garde was a revolutionary strategy to overthrow the government of Charles X and to end the restoration of monarchy and to re-establish a republic. And in those years, the creators who refused to return to the logic of dogmatic thought were at the crest of the wave of discontent. They were the visible vanguard of the struggle against the old regime. And if you find out, if we think it over, we can find that the idea of artistic and intellectual avant-gardes was rooted in the early 19th century but contained a very powerful revolutionary germ. It is in the origin of the Mexican Revolution, as I will show you later, and it is also at the origin of Lenin's thesis on political vanguards. The idea of revolutionary artistic avant-gardes by Saint-Simon crystallized very soon in a cartoon magazine with a very concrete political intent, and not until the early 20th century with movements like Cubism or Fauvism. It's very funny because some theoreticians say that you can have one specific idea concerning arts, but it takes decades sometimes to make them flourish. That was not the case. The ideas of Saint-Simon crystallized 5 years after he wrote them, after he wrote the idea of the artistic avant-garde. In November 1830, as you will, I'm sorry. This is Henri de Saint-Simon, so you can meet him. This is a very clever man, and he was more radical than people think, that people tend to concede him. And in November 1830, 4 months after the overthrow of the monarchical restoration, Charles Philippon, a businessman, a printer, and a satirical draftsman, launched La Caricature, a weekly illustrated magazine consisting of 4 pages of text and 2 loose sheets printed in lithography. Among the collaborators of the magazine were the writer Honoré de Balzac, no more, no less, and the draftsmen Honoré Daumier, Benjamin Roubaud, Jean-Ignace Isidore Gérard Granville, and Charles-Joseph Trabiès, among others. It was a whole contingent of talent, and with them, Philippon built a caricatural empire. In December 1830, the government hardened censorship, imprisoned Philippon, and from that moment on, the editor and his collaborators assumed a belligerent attitude against Louis-Philippe and became the revolutionary vanguard that sought to overthrow the July monarchy. Philippon and his artists confronted Louis-Philippe and his censors in a very long-term publicity war. From 1830, the artists of La Caricature adopted Saint-Simon's thesis that the artists could be the vanguard of transformation of society. And they did finally overthrow Louis-Philippe. It's an incredible story. In December 1832, alerted by the growing restrictions on press freedom, Philippon and his brother-in-law, the publisher Gabriel Aubert, founded a sister magazine of La Caricature, which they named Le Charivari, which translates in Spanish as El Cacerolazo, or a noise made in protests. That's what it means. These 2 magazines played an essential role in the overthrow of the citizen king. Cartoonists found a very effective way to diminish the importance of Louis-Philippe. They portrayed him as a peer, which means as an incompetent. In French, when you say, this guy is a peer, une poire, it's una pera, no? It means he's a blockhead. He's very dumb. He has no brains. He's just a bunch of juice. He has nothing inside. That's what it means. And Charles Philippon and his cartoonists started drawing Louis-Philippe as a peer. I'm sorry, I started this. Louis-Philippe, Philippon was even put in trial for drawing Louis-Philippe as a peer. And this is what he did. He started drawing, he made a first drawing of Louis-Philippe, and then he started distorting it until in 4 drawings, no? And the 4th drawing was the drawing of a pear. And Philippon said, well, is it my fault that the president looks like a pear, and he was acquitted. And you know something? The image of the pear got so popular that the police, the French police, made a survey on how many graffitis of a pear were drawn on the city. There were tens of thousands of graffiti of a pear drawn in the city. They were all started by the magazine of Philippon, and the result is that within the years, not in 1835, but later, Louis-Philippe was overthrown from power. And you know something? Louis-Philippe himself recognized the weight that cartoons magazines had in its fall. I'm going to read what Louis-Philippe wrote about what cartoons did to him. He writes, Louis-Philippe writes, "I was, during my reign, the victim of that weapon which Voltaire called the printed lie, a cowardly and perfidious weapon which often strikes without us being able to see where the blow comes from, a weapon whose wounds never heal because they are poisoned. When they attacked me, they attacked the royalty. Likewise, when, after 18 years of obstinate attacks, I was judged that the throne was sufficiently cracked, it only needed a push, and it collapsed to the great astonishment of my friends and my enemy. It no longer held." This is an historical fact. Some cartoonists and writers had the capacity to overthrow a government. That's a very important moment for this history I'm talking to you about. The artists of La Caricature and Le Charivari constituted a new type of creator, the revolutionary artist who militates through his art and works as a team to change society. Just as Saint-Simon proposed in 1825, these draftsmen used the power of art to transform society. By systematically breaking through the technique of caricature with all the canons of the Academy, they propelled a radical visual revolution. The aesthetical revolution of La Caricature was the visual expression of a profound social revolution that sought to defend freedom of expression and democracy, and that, for his purpose, had a precise political object: to denounce the abuses of the July monarchy and to defeat it, to reestablish fundamental freedoms like that of free expressions. Furthermore, this vanguard also implied the democratization of art insofar as it encouraged a new boom in the popular print market. To top it off, it consolidated political caricature as a fearsome and respectable journalistic genre. So there is a before and an after La Caricature in Le Charivari. And various historians have pointed out that for the first time after 1830, caricature began to play a role in daily politics. The impact of La Caricature and Le Charivari was so great that in many other countries, illustrated satirical magazines with cartoons emerged, announcing themselves as the local vision of Philippon's magazines, most of them with a liberal tendency. In Spain, El Matamoscas and El Sancho Gobernador lived from 1836 to 1837. And in England, the magazine Punch or the London Charivari circulated from 1841 until I'm sorry to say, well, these are some of the caricatures of La Caricature against Charles Philippon. As you can see, the drawings are fantastic. These are drawings by Daumier. This is a very famous caricature at the end of 1835, when Louis-Philippe dissolved the Congress. He painted him as a clown of the La Comédie de l'Arte, saying, "Le rideau est fini, baissez le rideau, la farce est jouée." Let's shut the curtains, the farce has been played. And you can see the drawings are fantastic, no? Well, I'm going to go a little bit quicker because I'm running out of time. And I have to say this very quickly, that these caricatures in Spain, these kind of caricatures started circulating in Spain, France, and they arrived in Mexico, also in the middle of the 19th century. And these are some examples I'm going to show you of how Mexican cartoonists just copied the images presented in La Caricature. Here at your right, you have the image of the Mexican caricature magazine El Telégrafo, and at the left you have the original image of Daumier at Le Charivari. And here's the same. I'll show you several images. At the left, you have the French images. At the right, you have the Mexican image. Once again, the French image, the Mexican image. As you can see here, by this way, my intention was to prove that Mexican cartoonists knew these magazines. They even copied what was on those magazines. But the important thing is that they started making something completely different. At one point, these magazines, since I don't have that much time, I'm gonna start singing. So I will try to make this story shorter. And to one point, these Mexican caricature magazines start flowering when the French invasion occurred from 1861 to 1867. And then something very interesting happened in Mexico. Those artists who were politically engaged became very hard militants of their cause. And they started militating very actively against the French, to the point where you see, this is a very impressive image. When the French arrived to Veracruz, see, the orchestra, the magazine La Orquesta, even called for his readers to constitute, how do you say, un regimiento, a regiment to go to fight against the French. And most of the liberal propaganda against the French during the period of the French intervention was made with songs and through caricatures and magazines. It's something quite weird. And this is, so they celebrated, for example, the triumph of El Cinco de Mayo. They always spoke well of Benito Juárez. And this is something very weird. When the French, when the Second Mexican Empire was overthrown, the habit of making politics through caricature remained. And it remained a very powerful means of the political debate. Caricature were central in the debate of Mexican 19th century politics. So the war after the French went, the liberals thought they would have finally a period of peace and brotherhood, and nothing like that happened. Liberals started to make they made personal factions, and they started a personal war among them, especially among the great leaders. Juárez fought Lerdo fought Porfirio Díaz, etc. And these guys, the cartoonists, followed. And then this happened. When Juárez died, Miguel Lerdo came into power, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada came into power, and Porfirio Díaz wanted to overthrow Lerdo. How did he overthrow Lerdo? He overthrew him basically, finally, because he made a military revolution, but basically he mined he started mining the prestige of Lerdo through cartoons magazines, which was called El Aguizote. And Lerdo was portrayed as the terrible dictator, etc., etc., etc. And when Porfirio got into power, he also, he was criticized very hardly, basically through caricature magazines, through cartoons magazines like El Hijo del Aguizote. Against Lerdo was published El Aguizote, so the disciples of El Aguizote published against Porfirio Díaz El Hijo del Aguizote. And they started to make two things that were very important from my point of view. They started building an agenda, a political agenda. This magazine started being a magazine of liberal radicals that were consequent with radical thoughts, you know. But they were what was very important with this thing is that they started evolving. And they started as liberal radicals, and they ended up being anarchists and socialists. And that's a story that has not yet been told, but it's very important. At the beginning, as you can see, they defended basically, where am I? They defended basically the liberal constitution of 1857, and they started denouncing Porfirio Díaz as a dictator. And they did something that was very important. For example, they started as, you remember the peer of Louis Philippe, right? Well, they started to draw Porfirio Díaz as a dictator himself. So Porfirio Díaz presented himself as a Republican president, but they started painting him as a monarch. So instead of the cetro, of the scepter, they presented him his sword, and they even named his sword. They named his sword La Matona, the one that kills. You see? And by that way, they started to push the idea that Porfirio Díaz was a dictator. And they also invented this character, which is fantastic, which is called Doña Paz Trancazo. Porfirio Díaz bragged about the peace he had brought to the country. And these cartoonists said, well, yes, he brought peace, but it's the peace the peace de los golpes, es la paz de los golpes. It's the peace of the people that are beaten constantly. So this is the name of a peace. It's a made-up name of a peace. The peace of la paz de la muerte, pues, no, the peace of death, no. And there's something else happened with El Hijo del Aguizote, which I believe is very important, is that. It is a magazine that lasted 17 years. And at the beginning, Porfirio was a very popular man, and it was very difficult to undermine his credibility. So they started making something very different. They made this magazine a school of resistance first. And that's the most important part, they started making this magazine a school for political teaching. It was a school of political formation. That's what they did for decades. And let me tell you something. They succeeded. They succeeded to the point from 1885, when the magazine started, to 1892, nothing happened in Mexico. But in 1893, all of a sudden, started a movement against the re-elections of Porfirio Díaz. And in 1893, a movement was started that was sparked by workers, the working classes, the first unions, and students. Among the students was a generation of young men that's called the generation of 1893. And among that generation, you have all the guys that later founded and started the Mexican Revolution in the beginning of the 20th century. Among them, the brothers Flores Magón, Soto, Silva, todos. They were all there. And something, it does not end there, but you can see, it does not end there. At the end, the image of Porfirio went downhill, and Porfirio started not to be as famous, as popular as he wished. And these are the guys, Ricardo y Enrique Flores Magón, that they first began supporting the anti-re-electionist movement, and they made an association with the director of El Hijo del Aguizote, who was Daniel Cabrera, to the point where Daniel Cabrera handed them the magazine of El Hijo del Aguizote. And that's where the revolution, the Mexican Revolution, began. And let me tell you something that's amazing. These guys were writers, and they, of course, dealt with draftsmen, but they, when Daniel Cabrera gave them the direction of El Hijo del Aguizote, they got into politics, and they, for the first time in decades, arrived to make make a point in overthrowing the Minister of War, who is Bernardo Reyes, and they celebrated it. They made it through the magazine. Bernardo Reyes was the right hand of Porfirio Diaz, and Porfirio Diaz at one point had to overthrow him because of a scandal that was triggered in El Hijo del Aguizote. And here's something that's very funny. This is a very famous image that was printed in 1903. But what you see here is something, I believe, quite impressive. It's the only photograph that was printed in El Hijo del Aguizote. But this is not a common piece. This is a performance. This is an installation and a performance. Years before the movement of Dada, this is an installation and this is a performance. What's the installation? How can I say that it's an installation? It's an architectural intervention of the building. People used to when someone died, they made some arrangements in the front of the house, like saying someone is dead, and people played their respects, and they had to put off their hats while passing through the street. But they made the whole arrangements, but at the end, the final day, they just wrote, who died? La Constitución ha muerto. It's the Constitution that's died. That's an installation. And it's a performance because all of the members of the editorial house posed in the balconies of the building, and they made, they had their photographs taken, and they had it printed. So everyone knew that someone was putting face against Porfirio Diaz. Someone was finally facing and defying Porfirio Diaz and showed themselves to defy Porfirio Diaz. And something else. After El Hijo del Aguizote, they made, this is something else. It's a manifestation of April 2, 1903. Which was the manifestation of Porfirio Diaz. That was the official celebratory act for Porfirio Diaz. So what did these guys do? They infiltrated the manifestation, and they turned it into an anti-re-election manifestation. That's also a performance. That's years before Dada, you see? That's avant-garde art, and that's really what that's what Saint-Simon was meaning in 1825 when he said, artists can transform society through an active role, etc., etc., etc. And something I will finish by telling you this. Of course, those editors were persecuted. They were thrown into jail. And they came out of jail to start the Mexican Revolution. When they came out of jail, they left in Mexico City some of their friends. And their friends, the friends of the Flores Magón and Soto y Gama, etc., made another magazine of caricatures, which was called El Colmillo Público. And in that the importance of El Colmillo Público in the Mexican Revolution is fundamental. Let me tell you up to what point it is fundamental. The basic document of the Mexican Revolution was a document published in 1906 that's called the Programa del Partido Liberal Mexicano. the program of the Mexican Liberal Party of 1906. Where was that document first printed? It was first printed fully in Regeneración in 1906, but it was that was the newspaper of the Flores Magón, and Regeneración was printed in Canada. But before it was printed in Canada, in Regeneración, this document was constructed in a dialogue between Flores Magón, his equipment, Juan Sarabia and his people, and the readers of El Colmillo Público. And the story is fantastic. It is documented by the Flores Magón. Flores Magón made proposed a first document. This first document made a certain proposals for the Mexican people. It basically picked up what we call the social rights. And the people sent letters and said, well, I would like to add this. And Flores Magón made the final document with those proposals. So that's where the document was found. Where do you see that? These are the artists that are interacting with their readers, no? And making a very different and making a different kind of, well, their main purpose was not to make art, was to use art to transform society. And they did. They sparked the Mexican Revolution. I'm gonna end up with one page and with the conclusions. It is, can art transform society? The study of Mexican combat caricature proves that yes, that they can even set revolutions in motion. By linking themselves with specific political movements, the artists of irony contributed with their work to the political and social changes of the country as their work influenced the nation to become freer, more democratic, and more self-aware. The combat caricaturists, content with the ephemeral glory of journalism, set aside the laurels of great art, since they are not interested in history, remembering them as great artists. They sought something more ambitious. They sought to change the world, to transform their country, to be a part of the history of their time. Their modest and tenacious artistic contribution was decisive for the history of Mexico. Their contribution was not made through spectacular strokes of genius or audacity, but with simple, constant work linked to a meticulous review of the country's political reality. The role played by El Hijo del Aguizote, El Colmillo Público, and El Aguizote Jacobino in the outbreak of the first social revolution of the 20th century confirms that the thesis proposed by Saint-Simon in 1825, that the artist can be the vanguard that transforms society, was correct, and that the editorial project proposed by Philippon's La Caricature in 1830 was an effective revolutionary war machine. The example of the popular militant artist that was born in Philippon's La Caricature in 1830s and was consolidated in the successive editorial offices of El Hijo del Aguizote and El Colmillo Público mark the Mexican artistic movement of the early 20th century. It is a project of avant-gardes, very different from the aesthetic avant-gardes that flourished in the 20s, but it is politically much more radical. And that's the point. Thank you very much. ¿No me colgué? ¿No me colgué? Perdón.
Rafael Barajas, El Fisgón, thank you so much for being the avant-garde of our 21st century. Rafael Barajas, El Fisgón. So we are selling his book. He's going to be on the back. He can sign them. We invite you to stay for the second book presentation.
Yeah, sure. Much more important than mine.
No, and I hope, so go to the back. Rafael is going to be signing the books. And stay for the second part of the presentation tonight is we're going to release 20 Years of Mexico Now. It's a book. It's coming. Stay with us and see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Rafael. Gracias, Rafael.
Al contrario.